She expected him to kill her, but instead he gave her his coat, his last food, and eventually his entire heart.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories. Turn on the bell icon so you can do not miss any new video.
The winter wind cut through the canyon like a knife made of ice, as Jacob Hartley guided his horse through the narrow pass. He had been riding for 3 days, trying to reach the small town of Cedar Falls before the worst of the storm settled over the mountains. His supplies were running low, and his bones ached from the cold that seemed to seep into everything. Jacob was a man of 32 years, weathered by sun and hardship, but his eyes still held a gentleness that surprised most people who met him. He had come west after the war, seeking silence and peace in a land that offered neither easily. He worked cattle ranches, broke horses, and kept to himself mostly. People in town called him reliable but quiet, a man who paid his debts and never looked for trouble. It was near sunset when he heard the sound. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then it came again, a soft cry that seemed almost human. Jacob pulled his horse to a stop and listened. The sound drifted from somewhere among the rocks to his left, weak and desperate. What do you think Jacob should do? Should he investigate the sound despite the dangers of the frontier, or should he continue on his journey to town where safety waited? If you believe Jacob should investigate, continue reading. Jacob dismounted and tied his horse to a sturdy juniper. He pulled his rifle from the saddle and moved carefully between the boulders, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The cry came again, and this time he could tell it was definitely human. He found her huddled in a shallow cave, barely more than an overhang of rock that offered little protection from the bitter wind. She was an Apache woman, her dark hair tangled, and her clothing torn and inadequate for the freezing temperatures. Her lips were blue, and she shivered so violently that her whole body seemed to vibrate. Beside her lay a bundle of rags, and Jacob realized with a start that it was a child, a little girl of perhaps 4 or 5 years, pressed against her mother for warmth. The woman looked up at him with eyes that held no hope, only a fierce determination to protect her daughter. She said something in her language. Her voice cracked and weak, but her meaning was clear. She expected him to hurt them or worse. Jacob had heard the stories, the hatred that ran deep between settlers and the Apache people. He knew that many men in his position would have turned away or done terrible things. The fear of the unknown was powerful, and the prejudices of the time ran through the territory like poison in a river. But as he looked at this mother and child, freezing and starving in the wilderness, he saw only 2 human beings in desperate need. He saw his own mother in the protective curve of the woman's body around her daughter. He saw his little sister, who had died of fever when she was just about this child's age. Jacob made a choice that would change everything. He lowered his rifle and held up his empty hands, showing her he meant no harm. Slowly, he removed his heavy coat and held it out to her. She stared at him with disbelief, her dark eyes searching his face for deception. When she found none, something in her expression shifted, a tiny crack in the wall of fear she had built around herself. She took the coat and wrapped it around her daughter first, then pulled the edges around herself as best she could. Jacob nodded and gestured for her to follow him. She hesitated, and he could see the war in her eyes. Trust was a dangerous thing to give, especially to a stranger, especially to a white man. What should Jacob do to earn her trust? Should he leave them food and supplies and go on his way, or should he stay and try to help them survive the night together? If you believe Jacob should stay, continue reading. Jacob gathered wood and built a fire at the mouth of the small cave, creating a barrier of warmth against the howling wind. He brought his bedroll and the remaining food from his saddlebags, a bit of dried beef, some biscuits, and a small bag of coffee. He heated water in his tin pot and made a weak broth, offering it to the woman first. She drank gratefully, then fed her daughter with a tenderness that transcended all language and culture. The little girl's eyes brightened as warmth returned to her small body, and she looked at Jacob with curiosity rather than fear. Through gestures and simple words, Jacob learned that the woman's name was Alaya, which meant sacred dance in her tongue. Her daughter was called Nida, meaning bear, They had become separated from their people during a raid by soldiers, and they had been wandering for nearly a week, unable to find their way back to their band or to any safety. Alaya's husband had been killed in the raid. She spoke of this with her eyes downcast, her grief still fresh and raw. Jacob understood loss. He had buried his own family, his parents to illness, and his brother to the war. Grief was a language he spoke fluently. That night, as the storm raged outside their small shelter, something began to form between them. It was not romance yet, not in the traditional sense, but rather a recognition of shared humanity. They were two souls who had known suffering, thrown together by circumstances beyond their control. Jacob stayed awake most of the night, keeping the fire burning and watching over his unexpected companions. Several times, Alaya woke and found his eyes on her, and slowly, the suspicion in her gaze began to soften into something closer to gratitude. By morning, the storm had passed and the world was draped in white silence. Little Nita was stronger, her cheeks flushed with healthy color instead of the frightening paleness of the night before. She smiled at Jacob when he offered her a biscuit, and that smile wrapped around his heart in a way nothing had for years. Now Jacob faced another decision. He could point them in the direction of the nearest Apache settlement and wish them well, or he could offer to escort them to safety personally, knowing the dangers such a journey would bring. If you believe Jacob should escort them, continue reading. The journey took 4 days. They traveled slowly, carefully, avoiding the main trails where soldiers or hostile settlers might spot them. Jacob taught Alaya some English words along the way, and she taught him phrases in her language. Nita became his shadow, riding in front of him on his horse and chattering in a mixture of Apache and the English words she was quickly learning. Each night around the fire, Jacob found himself drawn more deeply into Alaya's world. She told him stories of her people, of the mountains they called home, of the spirits that lived in the wind and the water. He told her about the farm in Ohio where he had grown up, about the green fields and gentle rains so different from this harsh and beautiful land. He noticed things about her that made his breath catch, the graceful way she moved, like water flowing over stones, the musical sound of her laugh when Nita did something amusing, the strength in her hands, and the kindness in her heart despite everything she had endured. On the third night, Nita fell asleep between them, and Alaya looked at Jacob across the firelight with an expression he could not quite read. "Why?" she asked, her English improving with each passing day. "Why help? Other white men, they—" She could not finish, but Jacob understood. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Because you were cold and hungry, and I had warmth and food to share. Because you are a mother protecting your child, and there is nothing more sacred than that. Because I was lonely, and you needed help, and sometimes those two things find each other." Alaya's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. She reached across her sleeping daughter and touched Jacob's hand briefly, a gesture of gratitude that sent electricity through his entire body. They found her people on the 4th day, a small band camped in a hidden valley. The reception was not friendly at first. Warriors surrounded Jacob, their weapons ready, their faces hard with justified suspicion. Alaya stepped forward and spoke rapidly in her language, gesturing at Jacob and at Nita. The tension slowly eased, though many still watched the cowboy with wary eyes. The chief was an old man with silver hair and a face carved by time and wisdom. He studied Jacob for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You brought our daughter home," he said in heavily accented English. "You will eat with us. You will rest. Then you will go." Jacob knew this was more than fair. He had no right to expect anything more. He should have been grateful for his life and the chance to ride away peacefully. But as the day wore on and the time came for him to leave, he found his feet would not carry him to his horse. He found his eyes constantly seeking Alaya in the camp, watching her reunite with family members, seeing her smile and weep with joy. Each time she looked back at him, something passed between them that neither company would deny. What should Jacob do? Should he leave as expected and try to forget this woman who had captured his heart, or should he find a way to stay? If you believe Jacob should find a way to stay, continue reading. Jacob approached the chief that evening with his hat in his hands and his heart hammering against his ribs. He spoke honestly about his feelings, about the connection he felt with Alaya, about his respect for her people, and his willingness to learn their ways. The old man listened without expression, and when Jacob finished, silence stretched between them. Finally, the chief called for Alaya. She came hesitantly, her eyes moving between the two men. The chief spoke to her in their language, and Jacob watched emotions play across her face. Surprise, then hope, then fear, then something that looked remarkably like joy. "He says you wish to court me," Alaya said softly. "In our way, with our customs. If you will have me," Jacob replied. "If you feel even a small part of what I feel for you." Alaya's answer was in her eyes, those beautiful dark eyes that had first looked at him with terror and now looked at him with the beginning of love. The courtship lasted through the winter and into the spring. Jacob learned to hunt with the men of the tribe, to speak their language, to respect their traditions. He was tested many times, sometimes by physical challenges and sometimes by tests of patience and wisdom. He failed some tests and passed others, but he never gave up, never faltered in his devotion to Alaya and little Nita. The girl had started calling him father in her own language, and each time she did, Jacob felt tears press against the backs of his eyes. On a morning in late spring, when wildflowers painted the valley in colors that seemed impossible, Jacob and Alaya were married according to her people's customs. They stood together before the Ole tribe, making promises of loyalty and love that transcended the differences in their backgrounds. That night, alone together for the first time as husband and wife, Alaya touched Jacob's face with gentle fingers. "You chose kindness," she whispered. "That night in the storm, you chose kindness instead of fear. I will love you forever for that choice." Jacob pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. "You were easy to choose," he said. "You and Nita. You were always the easiest choice I ever made. The years that followed were not without hardship. The frontier was an unforgiving place, and the tensions between peoples did not disappear simply because two hearts had found each other. But Jacob and Alaya built a life together, a bridge between two worlds. They raised Nita and eventually 3 more children. A family bound not by blood alone but by love and respect, and the daily choice to see each other as human beings, worthy of compassion. Jacob became known among both settlers and Apache as a man of peace, someone who could translate not just languages but understanding. Alaya became a teacher, sharing the wisdom of her people with those willing to listen. And always at the center of their story was that moment in a frozen canyon when a cowboy could have walked away, could have let fear guide his actions, but instead had chosen kindness. On their 20th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Jacob took Alaya's weathered hand in his own and raised it to his lips. "Would you do it again?" she asked him. The same question she asked every year. 1,000 times, he answered, the same answer he always gave. 1,000 times. "You were cold and hungry, and you needed help, and I was lonely, and I needed love. And somehow, in that terrible storm, we found each other." Alaya leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their family laughing and playing in the summer sunshine. "I was so afraid of you that first night," she admitted. "I know, and now I cannot imagine a world without you in it." Jacob smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Then do not imagine it. We still have many years ahead of us, many more storms to weather together." And they did. They grew old together in that beautiful, harsh land, their love a testament to the power of a single act of kindness. They proved that fear could be overcome, that differences could become strengths, that love could bloom in the most unlikely of places. When Jacob finally passed from this world, at the age of 87, Alaya was holding his hand. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, a living legacy of the choice he had made so many years ago in that frozen canyon. And as his spirit departed, Alaya whispered in his ear the words he had always longed to hear, words in her language that translated roughly to, "Thank you for choosing kindness. Thank you for choosing me. I will find you again, and I will love you again, in whatever world comes next." The story of Jacob and Alaya was told for generations afterward, a reminder that love requires courage, that compassion can conquer fear, and that sometimes the most important choices we make are the simplest ones. Be kind, help those in need, see the humanity in every person you meet, and perhaps, if you are very fortunate, that kindness will return to you 1,000-fold, in the form of a love that lasts beyond lifetimes.